Hi, welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today's topic is an orientation to the new adult education matrices. This week, our specific focus will be on the area of mathematics. My name is Molly DePasquale, and I work with Bloom Board, and I'm excited to be here today to be leading you through some of the exciting new changes to the mathematics matrices. Before we jump into the content, a few housekeeping points. First, if you have a question, the Q&A option is available to you. Feel free to use it and pop your question in there, and we'll do our best to respond to it real time or at a particular appropriate moment throughout the presentation. So everybody's microphones are muted, so you're in listen only mode. Just an FYI. And also today's presentation is recorded, so it will be archived and available on the IPDAY website within 48 hours if you want to share with others or if you want to listen to it again. Okay, so here is what we have on tap. We're going to start by understanding a little bit of the background and the development process for the new matrices. We're going to give an overview of the structure of the new matrices and how those really support some key principles and shifts that are consistent with the new standards frameworks. And the last piece is going to be to make some connections to how these matrices and some of the ways that they're organized can support instructional decision making and really be tools for educators. So we'll spend about 10 minutes here at the top of the hour, providing the rationale and giving the process for development. Then we'll dig into the structure and design principles that undergird the matrices. And we'll close out with an internalization activity that'll give you an opportunity to roll up your sleeves and familiarize yourself with these tools. Okay, so first, let's talk a little bit about sort of the rationale and the process for designing these new tools. As many of you know, Florida passed an executive order 1932, which really outlined a path for improving education by eliminating the old Common Core standards framework and instead reimagining and re-envisioning an improved standards framework that would really yield the potential to better improve graduates of Florida's K-12 institutions for career readiness and jobs of the future. And as out of this executive order came the development of the best standards framework, which have now been in use across K-12 classrooms. But because of the changes to the standards, again, away from Common Core to the new best standards framework, there's really a need to also do some work to improve and take into account the best practices that went into and the research that went into the development of the new standards framework in the adult education arena. And that's where the Bloom Board team has come in, and we've been working closely along with IPDAY and the Florida Department of Education to rewrite the adult basic education standards frameworks, again, to incorporate and take into account all of the new and exciting thinking that went into the development of the new best standards frameworks for K-12. So we did not sort of approach this work in a silo, right? We actually engaged a lot of stakeholders. We brought together a committee of Florida educators and administrators, experts in the arena of adult education, post-secondary program leaders. And we sat together and we actually did a number of different feedback sessions to get feedback on the new standards frameworks as they were being developed. and throughout the process, really lifted up some stakeholder voice and really took sort of a collaborative approach to, and as you can see, that collaborative approach spanned a number of months, bringing us to today's webinar, where we're going to be able to share some of the final versions of the matrices, which again capture the improvements that were made to the new standards framework. So it was definitely a meaningful process, and we really valued the feedback that we were able to receive from Florida-based educators throughout the endeavor. So as we sort of tackled this work, we really wanted to make sure that we had some design considerations to consistently apply to the development of the new standards framework. And so the first principle that guided and informed our work is around organization and terminology. So the new ABE standards, they are organized differently now, and they're organized in a way to align to the new organization of the K-12 best standards. So what we did was we adopted the organizational system, and I'll show you an example of the K-12 best standards, and we brought that over into the ABE standards framework. The nice thing is that means that overall there are actually fewer strands, not fewer standards, fewer strands. And so the overall standards framework is a little bit more, it's a little more streamlined, if you will, and allows for educators to make and see connections between related standards. We also combine standards. And so, as you know, one of the complexities with ABE standards is that the different ABE levels are equivalent to more than one grade level, K-12, right? So when you look at level 2, where you've got second and third grade standards, sometimes those standards are really different. And sometimes those standards are very much related, with potentially the third grade standard encompassing the second grade standard completely. And so in order to not have redundancy, what we did was we would combine standards, especially when they were very much related or one standard was a proper subset of the other. And so this was one way that we navigated the challenge, again, of each ABE level encompassing more than one K-12 grade level. I'll also show an example of that in a second as well. And then the last piece is really about, sometimes what happened is that when you look at where a standard fell in the prior standards framework, it actually fell at a different level than it did in the new best standards framework. And that happens specifically a lot in level 4, where a lot of what used to be middle school standards and middle school content actually got pushed up into high school in the best standards framework. So to navigate that and to preserve the alignment to the CASAS and the TABE assessments, we basically applied the rule of thumb that we kept any skill in its original level. So that way we weren't removing content that we knew that students would be assessed on at that level on TABE or CASAS at the end of the year. So again, that was another rule of thumb that we used in our development process. So let's see sort of what the new matrix looks like after all of this work, and again, with these guiding principles and design considerations in mind. So here again, this first slide emphasizes how the new math standards are structured, relying on and leaning on the organization of the best standards framework. So on the left-hand side, you see the old ABE strands. There were what, 2, 4, 6, 9 of them, right? A lot more different strands. Those strands have been combined and collapsed, again, achieving sort of this streamlined effect. And with the new ABE standards, consistent with the strands in the best standards framework, you can see there's now actually just 6 strands. One place where I think this is especially powerful is in the algebraic reasoning domain, which now fuses together 3 different strands from the prior framework. So it fuses together operations and algebraic thinking, expressions and equations, and ratios and proportional relationships, which really are all very much under that umbrella of algebraic reasoning. So seeing some of those connections is easier now because those have all been brought together into a single strand, the algebraic and reasoning strand. And then a quick note, you'll see the coding scheme here on the bottom of the slide that just lets you know how to read and interpret the codes for each of the standards. So we have subject, NRS level, strands, and then there is a number and sometimes an associated letter for the standard, followed by a number to indicate the benchmark. And we'll look at some examples here in a second. Okay, so here is the new standards matrix. Or sorry, this is a previous. I was like, this looks familiar. Okay, this was the previous standards matrix. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's bucketed by what used to be called domains. On the across the top, the columns are labeled by the NRS level. And you know, the impact is sort of loosely connected groups of standards that you can kind of see at each NRS level across each domain. And so I wanted to just show you this so that then you could sort of juxtapose and see side by side how the new standards matrix is organized. And this is a zoomed in picture of a single strand. This is the number, sense, and operations strand. And you'll also see in this box some of the key things that were preserved and key changes that went into the design of this new tool. So you'll see the columns still represent the NRS levels. And the rows list the different standards that are grouped by strands, right? So within number, sense, and operations, there's standard 1, NSO1, standard 2, NSO2, and standard 3, NSO3. And then you can see how those standards progress from level 1 to level 4. You'll notice, and this is very important, the language has been abridged. This is not the full version of the standard language. So it should not be used as a substitute for reading the actual standards, examples, and clarifications. It's really just a cheat sheet. And to facilitate its use to that end, we included the full coding scheme for each standard. So you'll see in the box, it says MAL1 NSO1. This allows an educator or a program leader to very quickly see, okay, this is the standard at this level. Then they know the code and then can easily access additional resources that might provide those examples or those benchmark clarifications in the more fully articulated standards framework document itself. I do want you to notice, and this goes back to one of the design considerations I mentioned earlier, that if you look closely at NSO2, at level 3, there's 2 distinct standards, 2A and 2B. That's because those skills were separate and discrete and could not really be collapsed into a single sort of umbrella standard. Contrast that with at level 4, where now there's only a single standard, and that's NSO2. At level 4, those standards were actually combined because the skills overlapped. So just wanted to share those two examples side by side so you can see an instance where the standards were combined at a level and an instance where the standards were not, in order to preserve unique and discrete knowledge and skills. Okay, so there's a couple other things I want to highlight that really get more into the mathematics that undergird the design of the matrices and sort of the approach to laying out the standards in the way that we did. So if you read about the development of the BEST framework and the beliefs about mathematics and about developing students as mathematicians, developing students' proficiency with mathematics, there are a couple underlying beliefs that really come out and surface across the standards framework. So one of them is a belief in the importance of applying math to solve real-world problems. And I'll highlight how that comes to bear and how that also is emphasized in the mathematics matrix. Another piece is the importance of making connections between and across grade level standards. It's so important for students to be able to connect the math that they are learning, both to their prior knowledge and then also across different strands within the grade level to solve rich and complex mathematical tasks. The last piece is really this belief in the importance of not just building conceptual understanding, but also building students' procedural fluency. And you'll see that spelled out in the matrix. If you look closely, there's really less of an explicit focus on conceptual understanding in grades 2 and beyond. Also, you'll see fluency expectations for key math procedures are introduced earlier. And I know that was a big thing with the shift to BEST was long division, and the standard algorithm for long division was moved from 6th to 5th grade. So how does this matrix really highlight some of these underlying beliefs about mathematics? If we look closely at the geometric reasoning strand, one thing you'll notice is that the words solve problems occur a lot across the different standards here. So actually, if you count them up, 60% of the standards in the geometric reasoning strand reference solving problems. So really, you can tell that the focus for students is not just geometry for geometry's sake, but really using geometric reasoning in order to solve real world problems that they might encounter. The new matrices also, they make it easier, not just to see the prevalence of problem solving as in the prior example, but also to make those connections between and across standards. So let's look at the fractions domain. And of course, we have to talk about fractions. But really, if you look at this single row from the matrix, you'll see there's actually only 6 total standards across L1 to L4 that focus specifically on fractions, just 6. You'll see if you read across standard 1, again, that's FR1, that row there, you'll see that it really relates to students understanding fractions, what they are, how they are really division problems and relate so closely to decimals, or what are sometimes called decimal fractions. When you read standard 2 from left to right, you can see that really the focus of that standard is around helping students perform operations with fractions, and that this is all building upon their foundational understanding of how to order and compare them, right? So again, there's a lot of really rich and important information that can be gleaned from reading the matrix from left to right, right? When we see how FR1, how those standards build, in this case, from NRS level 2 to NRS level 3. And how you see some of the topical and thematic ways that the standards in FR1 relate to each other, and how the standards in FR2 relate to each other and build on one another. A really important point here too, that is really important, I think, when we're thinking about developing students' mathematical understanding, is often we have students in our classes who may not have certain prerequisite knowledge. And so if we look at the matrix as a tool for pinpointing the skills that might be prerequisite or essential, we can see here how, in order for a student to be able to build a foundation of addition, subtraction, and multiplication operations with fractions, which is what they're doing at level 3, they first have to know how to order and compare fractions and identify equivalent fractions, right? And haven't we all had students who struggle with really being able to add or subtract fractions because they're unable to actually rewrite fractions with like denominators, right? So you can see very much how the work of level 3 builds upon the work of level 2 here. So in that way, this matrix is really a tool, an instructional tool for helping teachers pinpoint the prerequisite understandings from a prior grade level or a prior NRS level. The last thing to say about sort of the design of the matrix and how it supports these underlying beliefs about mathematics is really, if you look at this particular standard, again, this is in the number, sense, and operations strand, NSO2, you can see how some of the conceptual standards that are the focus of level 1 and level 2, they build quickly to level 3 and level 4, where the focus is more on procedural understanding. Or should I say procedural fluency, really. So in the yellow box, you'll see L1 is really about students understanding addition and subtraction. That's really conceptual. By level 2, students are adding and subtracting, but now their focus is on understanding the concepts of multiplication and division. But by level 3, students are extending their knowledge of addition to multi-digit numbers and decimals. And then they're performing at level 4, all 4 operations across rational numbers, right? So we go quickly from understanding, building the concept of these operations, to then being able to perform the operations, and then students extending their knowledge of those operations to other types of numbers. So first it's decimals, and then it's to the broader set of rational numbers. So, and I sort of got at this in one of the examples, but as you're thinking about preparing to teach students and how to use this matrix as a tool, it really helps educators answer 2 very important questions. One, based on the level I'm teaching, what prior knowledge might students need, right? And again, that's something that you can tell if you're teaching students at a level 4 by looking back at level 3, looking back at level 2, right? And the design of the matrix really supports that. And then also, where are there connections within and across the skills and knowledge within this strand? So that's going to give you a sense too of the types of application problems or tasks that might be relevant for students to work through, so that they're not just learning these different skills in isolation, but they're thinking about ways to apply many of those skills to solve complex problems. So now what I'd like to do is I've given you a quick overview of the matrix and highlighted some of the structural and design considerations. We are going to pop links to the new mathematics matrix into the chat. So my colleague is going to do that. Once you're able to click on that link, we would like for you to explore some of the potential connections and some of the instructional implications of the matrix by looking very closely at standard MA L3 NSO 2A. Okay, so that's the level 3 number sense and operations standard 2A. Once you've zeroed in on that standard, I want you to look first at the skills in level 1 and 2. What prior knowledge would your students need in order to tackle how this standard is articulated at level 3? And how might you connect back to those skills or that necessary prior knowledge? Then I want you to sort of zoom out and look across the strand and think about where do you see connections within and also across the NSO strand. What are some related skills and knowledge that you might use to reinforce the concepts, the knowledge and the skills that are required of students in order to demonstrate mastery, in order to be able to master that standard L3 NSO 2A. So first you're looking back at prior knowledge from previous levels 1 and 2, and then you're zooming out and looking across that NSO strand to see and name connections to the knowledge and skills of that L3 NSO 2A standard. So we're going to give folks about maybe 10 minutes for this exploration, and then we're going to come back together and share what we learned and possible instructional implications based on you completing this activity and reflecting on these guiding questions here on the slide. And we'll leave this slide up here for you. Oop. Awesome. Well, hopefully at this point you feel like you've had an opportunity to familiarize yourself with the matrix, how it's designed, and sort of understand how to leverage it in some of the ways that we have discussed over the course of this webinar. I see one participant already put their thoughts in the chat, but I'd love it to open up the chat and have invite y'all to record or share any of your reflections. What connections did you see to levels 1 and 2, prior knowledge? What connections did you see across standards within that strand that might have instructional implications? So I'll give everybody a minute to pop your thoughts into the chat. And definitely feel free to read what your colleagues have written in the chat. I know there's a lot of, I'm sure there's probably going to be a lot of really great ideas and information in the chat. So 1 minute to record your thoughts, and then I'll sort of synthesize and recap trends that I see. Okay. So just to synthesize some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat, I think one participant put this really nicely, that you can see that at level 1, they're sort of building the foundation, and then we're progressively moving to more complex applications of the mathematics, right? So we're starting with the foundation of addition and really understanding that concept. I noted a couple folks put in there that manipulatives might be helpful and appropriate at level 1. I think certainly there is a case to be made for that. And then when we think about sort of this progression to more complex, we're not just thinking about like multi-digit numbers, but we're also thinking about real world applications and applications of how do you use these operations to solve real world problems. I didn't see any connections across the strands. One thing I want to call out is if you look from NSO2 and you start to look up at NSO1, there is a lot of emphasis on place value there. So NSO1 is really about understanding sort of our base 10 number system, understanding place value. That's going to be really critical in order to help students understand multi-digit addition, multi-digit subtraction. Why do you borrow? It's going to be really important for students to also be able to understand operations with decimals, how to engage with tenths versus hundredths. And there's also a piece as well in NSO1 about converting between different types of rational numbers. So fractions to decimals, to percents, working with integers. So I think all of those things that are not necessarily, in the language of NSO2A or even NSO2, they're very related to that to the work of NSO2 when you start to look at sort of the broader strands and the other types of skills and understandings that are being built in other standards within that same strand, right? So how can we think about, again, making those connections back to place value is going to be really important in helping students be successful with the work of NSO2. So there's also a value of looking across the strand a little bit more globally to see what connected skills you might want to build on or extend upon to reinforce students' understanding. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Adriana, who is going to talk a little bit about next steps before turning it over to June from IPDA to formally close us out. So Adriana, over to you.